This is the landscape of Suffolk, home to Benjamin Britten. In today's programme, we'll be exploring the Serenade. From the opening notes of the haunting prologue, it's a piece that evokes the sounds of the natural world, and it also demonstrates Benjamin Britten's extraordinary affinity with the written word. This countryside is very familiar to me. Benjamin Britten was close to my family, and we used to visit him here in Suffolk. My father, Lennox Berkeley, and he were old friends, and Britten was my godfather. I feel deeply attached to his music. I used to sing it as a choir boy, and I learned so much from him, from the simplicity of his musical expression and the subject matter he chose. The Serenade is one of Britten's most sublime works, in both music and words, a treasury of English poetry drawn from Blake, Keats, and Tennyson, among others. We're going to hear a complete performance of the Serenade for tenor, horn and strings in one of Britten's favourite settings. He loved the architecture of East Anglian churches, and this one, Blythburgh, is a particularly stunning example. We've come here because this church was not only one of Britten's favourites, but is the place where, 20 years after its London premiere, Britten conducted his companion Peter Pears sing at their own Aldeburgh Music Festival. Sir Colin conducts the strings of the BBC Symphony Orchestra with the horn player Timothy Brown and the tenor Ian Bostridge.
Can we just try the opening, please, of the pastoral?
The first song in the cycle describes the setting sun casting long shadows as it sinks in the west.
Will you take your best sable paintbrush? Work less hard, so it's in the distance. It's such a unity, it's beautiful when one tries to let the music speak in the same way that Britten allows this poetry to speak his music. He doesn't subject the verse to some intellectual idea that he may have. He betrays his brilliance in the orchestra, but the singing line seems to follow the way oneself would read the poem.
What's so extraordinary about the Serenade is the way in which it does engage so thoroughly with wonderful texts, and because it's full of incredibly approachable but very novel musical ideas which don't lose their appeal on repetition.
I can't remember a time when I haven't known the Serenade, because I was brought up listening to it, and it's been one of the things which drew me to the horn. Every movement, every song works They're not easy particularly, but they work perfectly, I think, for what they do, and he really hasn't got anything wrong, in my opinion.
It's Benjamin Britten's special affinity with poetry and his remarkable ability to set the English language that we're going to look at more closely now. When the young Britten burst upon the scene in the 1930s, he was soon being talked of as perhaps the greatest British composer since Purcell. So where did this most original musical voice actually come from? Edward Benjamin Britten was born in 1913 in Lowestoft. The young Ben showed a precocious talent.
I started writing dots and dashes on a bit of paper when I was about 5, I think. In fact, I was more interested in writing it down than even what it sounded like. But very soon, when I got my mother to try and play these curious things, I realized that one has to connect the notes with the sound.
Many of the earliest pieces were drawn directly from the young Britten's personal experience.
I mean, it must be the only 5-year-old who's ever begun a piece in 8/4, which is a rather complicated time signature, hardly ever used. But I mean, the notation, the notes are all there. They make sense in themselves, but I mean, it really doesn't add up to a piece of music. So in a sense, it's writing it because he wants to see what something looks like when he writes it down on paper. I mean, the word setting, did you know that my daddy has gone to London today? Ho, ho, ho. No, 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 it says after that.
My serious composition lesson started when I was about 12, I think it was, when I had the very good fortune to meet Frank Bridge. He used to perform most terrible operations on the music. I would rather confidently show him. He would play every passage slowly on the piano and say, now listen to this, is this what you meant? And he really taught me to take as much trouble as I possibly could over every passage, every progression, every line, and I'm most grateful to him for that.
By his mid-teens, Britten was already an assured composer. He wrote everything in his head, dashing it down on paper at great speed. The Birds, written at the age of 15, sets a poem by Hilaire Belloc.
He said himself that he would actually not put something down on paper until he knew exactly what he wanted to write, which I think is only partly true. I mean, having actually watched him working, I mean, I know that he sometimes didn't know what was happening next. But even in these early sketchbooks, it's right first time, more or less.
Aged 23, a grateful Britten paid tribute to his mentor. He wrote a set of variations on a theme by Frank Bridge. It revealed a startling and original voice.
The Frank Bridge variations are, in a sense, the end of the apprenticeship. They're a homage to Frank Bridge, and the individual movements have titles. It's dedicated to FB himself, his integrity, his energy, his charm, which reflect the individual movements. It's a homage, but it's also a moving on. This is my last piece under your tutelage. This is my thank you to you. Now I'm going to be my own composer.
In 1935, the young Britten found work at the GPO film unit.
The shift is finished.
He provided music for a series of groundbreaking documentaries, including Coalface.
How much do we get by that? We're going up. We're going up. Keep the shop of late. We're going up. We're making up.
We should remind ourselves that some of the earliest manifestations of musique concrète, of using musical instruments to reproduce sounds from the mechanical or natural universe, these were developed for the first time by Britten and a tiny number of musicians within the area of documentary film.
The coal face is a mile from the shop.
The maverick poet W.H. Auden was responsible for the poetry on Coalface.
Sure. Busy. Rolling wavement. Pepper. Hitter. Skipper. Running fitter. Swingman. On setter. Overman. Helper up. Oh! On setter.
It was an important collaboration for Britten, who shared Auden's left-wing political and pacifist views.
One has to think of the wealth of knowledge that Auden commanded. He was, as it were, an education to which Britten enjoyed unparalleled access. And on the other hand, Britten himself was enormously taken by the poetry to which he was extraordinarily sensitive. I mean, he had a tremendous feeling for words, as we know. And Auden, with words, was a master conjurer, and was that kind of fiery but wonderfully controlled inspiration and creativity that obviously would have made the most enormous appeal to Britten.
Look, stranger, at this island now, a leaping light for your delight discovers. Stand stable here and silent be, that through the channels of the air may wander like a river, the swaying sound of the sea.
Auden was in turn delighted, saying, "One had always been told that English was an impossible language to set or sing. Here at last was a composer who set the language without undue distortion."
And its tollages oppose the pluck and knock of the tide, and the shingle scrambles after the sucking surf, and the gull lodges a moment on its chillier side.
He obviously started off partly under Auden's sort of jurisdiction, and Auden himself was a remarkable anthologist, quite apart from being a wonderful poet, and Auden influenced, I think, obviously some part of Britten's taste, but you can tell from those very early things that Britten said long before he met Auden, that he obviously had a very personal and extremely wide feeling for poetry in general. In fact, I believe it is his feeling for poetry which actually governs pretty well the whole course of his musical direction.
I was very much influenced by Auden, not only in poetry, but in life too. He went to America, I think it was late 38, early 39, and I went soon after and felt that I would make my future there. Many of us young people at that time felt that Europe was more or less finished. There was this great Nazi fascist cloud about to break at any moment, and one felt that Europe didn't have the will to resist.
He arrived in America, as he later said, muddled, fed up, and looking for work. His travelling companion was a singer, Peter Pears.
Well, I was really going as his esquire, I think, in a way. I was perfectly aware of his stature and how great he was. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I was copying out the score of various things, and in fact Auden had got part of an old house filled with sympathetic friends, including for one time Gypsy Rose Lee. But in fact the atmosphere was really too bohemian, and we didn't stay there very long.
Britten was not only discovering himself and his music and the scope and the ability and the capacity that he had as a composer, but he was also discovering his relationship to Peter Pears. And in America, finally, they did become lovers, and from that day onwards, Ben's life was never the same. And there's that marvellous chorus, you know, in Paul Bunyan, once in a while the odd thing happens. Once in a while the moon turns blue. And I remember Ben sitting there and saying, well, of course, Donald, that was Peter.
One of the first pieces Britten composed for his newfound love was a song cycle. He used a collection of sonnets by the great artist Michelangelo.
I can't think of anything in later song cycles which you could call love music. Always the subject is sort of oblique and at the edges, but the Michelangelo does really celebrate this with pleasure and frankness and bravura that he never found again.
It was an amazing relationship between two very remarkable men. In a very high proportion of Britten's works, Peter is there embedded in the music, not exactly as the only begetter, but certainly as a very major inspiration.
The earthquake is not satisfied at once, and in such way I wrote upon myself until I seem to hear a voice that cries to the horse it sleep no more.
The vocal pieces were written, so many of them with my voice in mind, that I could just try it out on him. And there, if he'd written a difficult phrase, I could just see whether I could sing it or not. And if I could adequately, he probably kept it in. If I couldn't or thought it was too difficult, I may be said to have vetted from my own point of view.
The thing that always moves me about singers is that the voice is something which comes naturally from their personality and is a vocal expression of their personality. I loathe what is normally called a beautiful voice, because to me it's like an overripe peach which says nothing.
The nibbling mouse is not asleep, but he goes beep, 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 beep. I think Britten was aware more than any other composer, apart perhaps from Francis Poulenc, of the colour of the human voice and the way registers work in the human voice, simply from the fact that he works so closely with a singer, and in his case actually lived with a singer. You can see in all of the many, many wonderful pieces he wrote for Peter Pears that he's exploiting the very particular colour of Peter Pears's voice, but also exploiting the more general register features of a tenor voice, I suppose.
Life in America provided distraction and some employment, but Britten was feeling increasingly uneasy. Disturbed by events in Europe and missing his friends and family, he wanted to go home.
This year in England, people prayed for a dark and windswept night. On nights like these, the German bombers stay at home. A stormy night is an ally of England.
Memories of Suffolk and a feeling of rootlessness forced Britten and Pears into a decision.
We began to feel a tug about wanting to go home and do whatever was to be done. And at the same time, Ben happened to get hold of a copy of The Listener, in which was printed an article about Peter Grimes and Crabbe. And the reading of this article stirred Ben so deeply that he felt he couldn't stay in America anymore. And it took us 6 months or more before we could get a boat to take us back to England.
On the boat back from America, I started setting English poetry all over again. And I think the Serenade was part of the whole business of falling in love with England all over again and falling in love with English poetry.
And the ideal country retreat awaited him, the old mill at Snape, near the Suffolk coast. Overjoyed at being home, he went straight to work.
I think Britten returned from America at the absolute peak of his form. He was technically confident in his language, and the 10 years or so afterwards, a bit longer, till the late 1950s, surely has all his greatest, best loved and most successfully realised music in it. The Serenade inaugurates that.
Written in April of 1943, while working on his opera Peter Grimes, the Serenade is, to put it simply, a 25-minute piece setting 6 poems on the theme of night. Each poem takes us further towards the moment of sleep.
Nocturne, please, yeah. That's the second song. Ian wants to do this one pianissimo, so we'll...
He obviously understood what constitutes effective string writing, and he did play the viola himself, which obviously will have given him an insight into what works and what is going to make the instrument sound at its best.
Right on the fingerboard, and don't bite it too sharply, please.
In the Nocturne, Tennyson depicts dying echoes as a metaphor for the fleeting nature of man's existence.
Oh, hark, oh, hear how thin and clear, and thinner, clearer, farther going. Oh, sweet and far from cliff and star.
Britten was a good writer for everybody. He had such an insight into virtually every instrument of the orchestra. It may seem naive to quote the young person's guide, but that you've only got to listen to that, to the variations for every single instrument and the families to see how he really understood writing for instruments. And allied to that, it's a joy for me to play a lot of his music because he does feature the double bass quite heavily.
A famous aspect of wartime musical life to which Britten returned was the series of lunchtime concerts at the National Gallery. The orchestra of the RAF Central Band was a regular fixture. At the back of the orchestra was a 20-year-old horn player whom Britten was shortly to meet and who was to have a vital role in the Serenade. This player was to become legendary. His name was Dennis Brain.
On this instrument you have valves, and by combining the series of notes that you can obtain on each valve, you can get a complete chromatic scale like this.
Dennis Brain was a really prodigiously talented player. His dentist, who I once saw, was an expert on wind playing and told me that Dennis had the most perfect teeth and so on, and he said they were just right. I don't actually think that explains his great talent, but he was extraordinary. Britten came across him during the war, and he was very struck by Dennis Brain's ability to play with such ease, he said, clarinet-like facility and accuracy, which was very suitable for Britten. I think he picked up on that rather English characteristic of clarity.
In his contact with Brain, he must have then formed all kinds of possibilities of what colours you could get out of horn. He could sing, He could scream, and he could dance, and he could do all the things that one thinks the horns are a bit too creaky in the joints to do.
Oh, yes. How did you do it? You moved the valve very slowly, did you?
It's very dangerous.
I know. I'm just telling clarinet players they can do that. It's like a ping, ping, ping. If you go, you've got a fabulously guarded bit, it might squeak.
Ben Britten is a very precise thinker and technically very expert. I think he took great trouble to find out if he didn't know too. He would talk to the players and ask them things, is this possible, and so on.
The first performance of the Serenade shared the billing with a piece by my father at the Wigmore Hall in October 1943.
It so happened that I was able, in wartime, to get to the Wigmore Hall for the first performance of the Serenade. Of course, Peter was the soloist, Dennis Brain was the horn player, and the orchestra was conducted by Walter Gurr. I do remember thinking at the time how extraordinary it was that the Serenade actually didn't just have one soloist, but in fact two soloists, indeed that it was a kind of a concerto, if you like, for voice and horn and orchestra.
The third song in the cycle is William Blake's dark lamentation for lost innocence, The Sick Roads.
It's interesting, the pairing of the horn and the tenor, I think, because they're two slightly edgy instruments. You know, the horn and the tenor are the voice and instrument that crack most often in tense situations.
Here we begin to sense something which he developed very strongly later on, which is an ambivalent attitude to nature, which comes to fruition in the turn of the screw. He picks up the idea of the dangers that lie in natural beauty and the decay that is threatening everybody. I think it belongs to that part of Britain's heart, which was for him his most vulnerable.
Yeah, we're at O Rose. Rose, thou art sick. I mean, this is a bad piece.
Yeah.
Yes, you look all right, but I know what's going on.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Whoa. Rose, thou art sick. Invisible. Yeah, that doesn't say that. The invisible one. Although invisible is too bland.
It's quite worm-like.
The word worm is bad enough. Worm. The invisible worm, not the ones, not the larder beetles that come out at night.
Shortly after the Wigmore Hall premiere of the Serenade, Britten took Piers and Brain into the recording studio. The discs even reached Australia in wartime.
I had just left school, and we managed to get hold of those old Decca 78s, shipped out from England, I suppose, And the serenade reached us like the scales falling from our eyes. In this case, I suppose it would be the muffs from our ears. And it seemed to us, not only was a great musician arriving, a great composer, but it seemed as though here was something that really did justify the existence of poetry as well.
Let's do figure 14, please. Christ receive. Bum. It's very noisy in here. Will it go any quieter?
The dirge is a medieval dialect warning of the terrifying horrors of purgatory.
Just as vicious, but further away. The hobgoblins. Hieronymus Bosch, isn't it? Toasting forks and things up your arse. Absolutely.
I think that the Serenade is a very demanding piece technically. On the other hand, I always feel sort of vocally healthy when I sing it. It's written in full consciousness of what the voice can do and how the voice can be given rest and can be given sort of little cures, like after singing the dirge, having the hymn as a sort of cure to get the voice moving again in a different way.
Queen and huntress chaste and fair, how the sun is laid to sleep, seated in fine silver chair, state in quoted and keep.
Ben Jonson's hymn is a witty tribute to Diana, goddess of hunting and of the moon.
I know a lot of my literary friends say, well, you know, you can't do this to poetry, it's perfect already. I myself think that what he did particularly was where a poem was perfect, as in Keats's sonnet at the end of the Serenade, the sonnet to sleep, O soft embalmer of the still midnight. A poem you might think that was so saturated in sugar already, you couldn't much you could do with it. What he does, he actually adds extra sugar, an extraordinary thing to do, and it turns out to be one of the most amazing settings of any kind of voluptuous poem, because it becomes more voluptuous instead of less voluptuous. He doesn't detract from it, nor does he underline it, he adds to it.
The final song, for singer and strings alone, addresses sleep and evokes the darkest moments of the night, when guilt and fear can grip the soul.
And then in lulling.
Oh, soft embalmer of the still midnight, shutting with careful fingers and benign our glow-pleased eyes. Night and dreams can release many things which one thinks had better not be released. And one can have dreams which do color your next day very darkly.
What colour do you want? English Baroque? I think the last section will be all.
Yeah.
Sleep is overtaken everything. There we should play religious or sensible.
Yeah.
I remember, you know, so very clearly at an Edinburgh festival when the church operas were being performed in a big church. And Ben and I think we had to run to get in because we were late arriving. And as we settled into the coolness of the church and the darkness and were awaiting whichever church parable it was to start, Ben turned to me and breathed, whispered in my ear, night and silence. Those are the two things that matter most to me. And I've always remembered those extraordinary words, and particularly in relation, in fact, to the Serenade, because it is exclusively devoted to the idea of sleep and dreams, and of course with that further beyond the final dream of all, which is death, and which Ben was aware of, I think.
40 years after the Serenade was first performed, A chance discovery was made by the daughter of Britten's publisher, Erwin Stein, which threw new light on the piece.
My father gave some papers to me in a trunk to keep, and it wasn't until somebody asked me for a letter, which she thought I had, and I said, well, I've never really looked in that trunk down there. It's been there for a long time, and I'll go and have a look. And I opened it, and some of it had got a bit damp and a bit spoiled, some of the material there. But I suddenly saw a familiar handwriting in form of a manuscript in Britten's hand. And there it was. It was a complete song called Now Sleeps the Crimson Petal. It was extraordinary.
They're always with the song cycles. There are songs that didn't fit in. He would write more than he needed and then make a selection. So this one got left out, but it clearly belongs to the Serenade. It has exactly the same sketch layout of the voice and the horn and the strings. And this one is actually called Serenade. I mean, thank goodness it has survived, because it's one of the most beautiful of all the settings. A very intimate and beautiful number.
Now sleeps the crimson petal, now now waves the cypress in the palace wall. No winks the goldfinch in the porphyry font. But while thy wakens, waken thou with me. Now droops the milk-white peacock like a ghost, and like a ghost she glimmers unto me. Now lies the earth all dead to the stars, and all thy heart lies open unto me. Now slides the silent meteor, and leaves a shining halo. As thy thoughts in me, now folds the lily all her sweetness up, and slips into the bosom of the So fold thyself, my dearest, and slip into my bosom, and be lost
Had Now Sleeps the Crimson Petal remained in the Serenade, that would have altered the balance of everything, and above all, it would have brought eroticism directly to the fore. And I think he was right to leave it out, and I think he was right to give us a Serenade which is more lightly balanced, more conversational, in a way more playful, apart from the serious Blake and the serious Keats at the end.
The Serenade ends with a brilliant dramatic device. The solo French horn plays precisely the same music as in the opening prologue, but with the direction off stage. And during the making of this film, Colin Matthews made an interesting discovery.
Here you can see he's actually erased with a razor or a penknife. Of prologue has been scratched out. It obviously was originally the epilogue, and it looks as though, in fact, there was only an epilogue to begin with. I imagine that once the epilogue had been heard during rehearsal, during performance, it probably made a prologue necessary. What is extraordinary is the way that the two sound different once you've been through the work, even though the music is exactly the same.
There is something moving in the final separation of the voice and the horn. When you've been working together with the horn player throughout the piece, suddenly you're separated. The horn player walks off the stage, you sing the sonnet, and in response to the sonnet, the horn player plays the epilogue. And that's the most wonderful piece of imaginative writing, I think.
During the course of the Serenade, one seems to go on a journey. For me, the pastoral is simple, it's not dark in meaning. Then the nocturne is about dying, and I think that it's darker than I realized. Then the elegy, the blank, very, very dark indeed, very painful. Beauty turns to rottenness. And the dirge is terrifying. The hymn is incongruously light and wonderful after that, and I think perfectly placed. And then the sonnet to sleep, where the listener or whomever achieves sleep, should be the end. But then this framing epilogue with an unseen player has a quite wonderful effect. I've actually played the prologue and epilogue at my father's memorial service, and also that of a friend, William Golding. And actually Golding's daughter wrote me a letter in which she said how the sound of the horn, which is produced by the breath, and she noted that breath and soul are the same word in Latin, animus. And she said the listener can be taken somewhere away by this sound, which has no observable source.
Queen and Huntress, chaste and fair, how the sun is laid to sleep, seated in fine silver chair, state in book in anarchy. Hesperus entreats I light, Hesperus entreats I light, goddess, 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 let not thy envious shade dare itself to interpose, since your shining orb was made, have to clear when day did close. Bless us then with vision's height, bless us then with vision's height, goddess, goddess, goddess,